Hey there. In this video, we'll be talking about a feature called CSS or Cascading Style Sheets. And I'm going to run through this kind of written tutorial. So, depending on your preference, you can watch this or read that, or a combination of both is what I actually recommend. But kind of up to you. I'm just going to run through this content. So where we are right now, I'm assuming that you've seen a little bit of HTML. You know how to create an HTML file and use HTML tags to create some content, and then deploy that HTML file using something like GitHub Pages or like CodePen or Replit or something like that. But the idea is you use HTML tags to create content. So let me maybe just jump to like a Scratch file real quick. So I've checked out my sample project repo here, and I have this Scratch directory here. So I'm going to maybe work from this file or from this directory. So I have that opened up in my text editor here in Atom. You can use whatever text editor you want, including something like Replit. But here's how I'm going to write it, at least for this intro part. So I've got my HTML file, and it's got some tags in it, and that's all good. That's cool. Let me see how I want to do this. Let's do this. Let's do this. Okay. So I've got my content here, my HTML file here, and then I've opened up that file over here in my web browser, using the techniques that we would have talked about in a previous video. And this works, cool. Now I can add some HTML tags, and I can maybe say like, I don't know, hello world. Whoops, I already have hello world in here, don't I? Whatever, it doesn't actually matter. The content itself is not super important. I just want to get something working. And whoops, I forgot to close my tag. Like I said before, like getting tags wrong and debugging and all that stuff is honestly a big part of coding. So that's an example of it. Anyway, there we go. I've got maybe a p tag. Maybe I'll just say welcome to my website, something like that. And I've got my content. Cool, great, wonderful. Everyone's happy. And I could go to my favorite search engine and look for like other HTML tags, HTML list tag, whatever, and I can learn more, and I can do all of that. And that's what we would have talked about, previously last week. But the limitation that you've probably encountered is this doesn't look very interesting. It's, a white background, some black text. There's some default styling to it. So like an H1 tag is big and bold. A P tag has a certain style. Different tags have default styling that the browser applies to it. But it's not super pretty, and it certainly doesn't like look like a real website, whatever that means. And so it's just kind of gross looking, right? And chances are, if you have spent a few days in HTML, you are getting to a point where you want to change what your content looks like. And the way you do that, spoiler alert, is through something called CSS. So I'm going to run through this, but maybe just to like introduce the syntax or like what you actually type. Maybe I'll just do it over here kind of manually. So the way you can think about CSS is it starts with a new HTML tag. And I'm going to put it in the head section. You can actually put it wherever, but typically it's in the head section, and the HTML tag is the style tag. So I'm going to type style in an HTML tag like that. And I'm going to close it, maybe just to make sure that I have a closing tag before I forget it. Maybe give myself some room to type some stuff. So this is just a normal HTML tag, but the content of this HTML tag is CSS, which has its own kind of rules about what it expects. So similar to how like HTML expects tags, CSS, which again is what we're writing inside the style tag, CSS expects a set of rules and a set of like properties. So a set of like selectors and properties. So a selector, let's just start by saying, you know what, this p tag is really boring. I want to give it a, I don't know, a neon green background. So I can say p for p tag, and then an open curly brace, and then usually some white space. So put in a new line, and then a closing curly brace. Okay, we can save that actually and refresh. Nothing will have changed, hopefully. Yep, cool. So I don't actually do anything in my CSS yet. I have a selector, which is a P selector, and then I have room for some styling, but I don't actually have any styles yet. So now let's do that. So inside of the curly braces, I'm going to have a list of like properties. So like a key and then a value. So something like, what did I say, background? So something like background, I think it's background color. And let's say, I don't know, green to start with, and then a semicolon. You are going to forget your semicolon, and it's going to mess up your CSS, and your page is going to look weird, and you're not going to know why. Missing a semicolon is maybe the most common bug in code in general. So don't forget your semicolon. So I'm going to save that, and I'm going to go back here. I'm going to refresh. And there is my background. It's a little too dark. Maybe I'll change that to like lime. I don't know. There we go. There's my beautiful eye-searing neon fluorescent green background for my p tag. And that's the fundamentals of CSS, really. You have a style tag, you have a selector, and then you have some properties with some styling to it. Now, from here, what you can do is find more properties, basically. So similar to how before I said don't bother memorizing HTML tags, because what you do is you use search engines and resources like W3 Schools and MDN to learn about new HTML tags. The same thing is true of CSS. So don't try to memorize every single CSS property. You can't. There are thousands of them. Instead of memorizing them, just understand the fundamental workflow of having a selector and then having some properties. And from there, it's, in quotation marks, just a matter of finding out what those properties are. So I don't know, let's go to search engine and type in like CSS properties, something like that. And sure, MDN is always good. Let's check that out. And here are some of the many properties that you can set on a particular selector. In this case, we are selecting the p tag. So I'm going to kind of pick one maybe arbitrarily. So the way I would think about this is like, I don't know, I go in with a goal. In my first example, I wanted a green background, but now I say, you know what? The green background is okay, but I would like a border around it, actually. So, spoiler alert, long story short, here we go. There's a border property, and that seems promising. So let's click into that. And you can read through resources like MDN or W3 Schools or whatever other resources you find and learn about the different kinds of values that it takes. So medium dashed green, okay, that's like a width, a style, and a color, okay. And again, read all about like the different things that it expects. So I am going to maybe say border solid. I liked that kind of default border solid example. Okay, so I'll go with that. And I've saved it, and now let me jump back over to the rendered HTML. And there you go. There's your border. And you can likely imagine, applying that same process over and over again. So maybe actually what I want is this text to be red, or this, whatever your design requires, maybe some more spacing or padding or something. But the idea is the same. You start with a selector, you've got your properties and their values, and you find the property that does what you want, and you apply it. That's CSS. Video over. I'm mostly kidding. that's honestly like 50% of what CSS is. Everything else is just getting into more specific behavior of different selectors and different properties. But the fundamentals are selector, properties, find properties. Okay, so that's the fundamentals of CSS. Let's talk about element selectors. So we actually already have one. Here's an element selector. So if I go to my content, I can see that I have like an H1 tag here and a P tag. And what I'm saying is, hey, for P tags, make every P tag or every P element, every paragraph element, make it have a background color of lime and a border of solid, so a solid border. Okay. So I can do something similar. I can say, you know what, now I love my eye searing green paragraph, but this H1 could use some design. So I'm going to say H1, selecting the tag. A tag selector is just the same exact, thing as the tag in element, the same name. And I can apply some properties. So I don't know. Let's pick one kind of arbitrarily. Actually, let's go back to that border and look at like other options. So dashed red. Let's try that actually. Border. And then a colon, and then the property name. In this case, the property is like 2 words. Doesn't have to be 1 word, doesn't have to be 1 letter, doesn't matter. Different CSS properties will have different kinds of values that it expects. So what did I say? Dashed red. So I'm going to save that, and I'm going to go back to my rendered HTML over here. And there we go. There is my beautiful H1 element in the dashed red border that I have given every H1 tag. So to maybe like point out the way element selectors work is, let's say I have multiple P tags. So I can say, I don't know, I should have come up with this content before maybe, but I'm going to create a new P tag that says, my name is Kevin and I love CSS. So goofy, but whatever. Maybe add some new lines, fine. So I'm going to refresh, and you'll see that the new P tag also has the same styling as the original P tag, because the element selector that we've used here, which is just the P tag, applies to every P tag. So no matter how many P tags you have on the page, that same style or the same set of styling properties and values will apply to every one of them, every P tag. Same thing is true of the H1 tags. So just to prove that, I'll say H1 hi world, whatever. I'm really bad at coming up with example text while I'm talking, but there we go. You can see that the same thing kind of works. Okay, so that's element selectors. You have the name of the tag and then in curly brackets a list of properties, which are property names and then property values. Cool. So that works. That's all good. But what if I don't want every single P tag to have the same styling? What if I don't know, maybe I have a third one down here that's like P, this is the bottom. So I have 3 tags, and maybe what I want is this third P tag down here to have a different style. How would I do that? And one way you can do that is something called the ID selector. So first what I'm going to do is give my element here a ID attribute. So I'm going to say space ID equals, and then in quotation marks, I'm going to give it an ID, which can be anything. In this case, I'm just going to call it like bottom. You can call it anything you want. Does not matter. But I'm going to call it bottom. And then, so this won't do anything. This won't change anything because we haven't actually changed any of the styling. It's just an attribute on the tag that HTML doesn't actually do anything with. It's just there for us to use. So now that we have that, now that we have the ID on that P tag, what I can do is use a ID selector, which is similar to the element selector, but it has a whatever you call this symbol. Kids these days call it a hashtag. It's called the pound symbol, depending on who you ask. But this symbol, the hash symbol, and then the name of the ID. So in our case, we said bottom, and then curly braces, exactly like we did with the element selectors. So what do I want to do with the bottom? Maybe I want to set the font size. So if I don't know how to do that, what I can do is CSS font size maybe, and read all about it. W3 Schools is a great resource. Here I go, looking through it, so I can give it like a specific pixel size that seems promising. I can use M, and I can read more about what M is. I can use, any combination of any of the above. So, all right, cool. So let's maybe just use pixels at first. I don't know, 20 font size : 24 pixels, maybe. Let's just see what that looks like. I'm going to save that. And what I expect to happen, because this p tag has the ID of bottom, and I've styled the ID of bottom with an ID selector here, and I gave it a font size. Let's refresh. And there you go. You see that the bottom p tag has a larger font than the others because I have styled it with the font size property here. Okay, so maybe I'll pause here for a second, and the word CSS, the words cascading style sheets, it's like a really weird term. Like what does cascading style sheet mean? And we'll talk about style sheets, I guess, in a second, but I want to focus on the cascading part, the C of CSS. Notice that this bottom p tag, this bottom paragraph, it has the font size that we gave it based on the ID selector, but it also has the styles that we applied to every p tag. So if you look at our styling, we can say, all right, we use a p element selector to give every paragraph a line background and a solid border. And so every paragraph has that. In addition to that, we have the bottom ID selector, which changes the font size of the element with that ID to 24 pixels. And that is indeed what happens. So you get both. You get a mix of your element selectors and your ID selectors, and they kind of combine or cascade into one sort of total style. The other kind of attribute of the cascading nature of CSS is you can get more and more specific. So let's say that, I actually want my bottom p tag to have a different background. So maybe I'll say in bottom, I'll say background color of cyan, like a bluish color. And you might, before we actually refresh it, you can ask yourself which one is going to win. This is a p tag and it has the ID of bottom, but both of those have a color. P tags are lime. The bottom element is cyan. So what's it going to be? Is it going to be lime? Is it going to be cyan? Maybe a mix? I don't know. So let's refresh and find out. And it is indeed cyan, and that's because there's this concept of specificity in CSS. I am shocked that I said that word correctly the first time I tried. But basically the ID selector is more specific than the element selector. Element selector is quite broad, it's quite general. So anything that's in an ID selector will override anything that's in a more general or a less specific selector, like the element selector here. So you can cascade that way. So cascading is both kind of the all of the styles that apply to an element, but it also has rules about which one it picks when they disagree, and that's all related to cascading, the cascading nature of style sheets. All right, so that's ID selectors. One thing I'll point out with ID selectors is IDs need to be unique. You can maybe get away with it for a while if you have multiple elements with the same ID, but once we get into things like JavaScript, your code will break. So just keep in mind that only one element can have a particular ID. So like, don't do something like this, ID equals bottom here. Don't have two IDs that are the same on two different elements. You can only use one ID once, if that makes sense. You can have, this one can be a different ID. You can have this one be middle, and that's totally fine because middle only occurs once and bottom only occurs once. And so the IDs are unique. You can have multiple IDs in your page, but each of those IDs needs to be different. So they're unique IDs. That's IDs. Now let me just go back to this and say refresh. Okay, so here we are. So I just said that IDs need to be unique, but what if, I don't know, what if I wanted to apply this bottom style to multiple p tags? Not every p tag, but more than one. So let me maybe add another p tag here just to get some content going and say, I don't know, my favorite animal is cats. His HTML, his content is goofy, but whatever. So now I have 4 total p tags, right? And now what I want to do is I want, I don't know, my middle 2 p tags to have the same, have some similar styling. And I could, I don't know, there are a few ways I can do this, but like with the tools that we've seen so far, we wouldn't want to do ID equals, I don't know, middle for these two because IDs need to be unique. So what you can do instead is something called a class. So that's very similar to IDs in that you add an attribute as class equals, and then in quotation marks, the name of your class. In this case, I don't know, let's call it middle. And now the big difference between classes and IDs is that classes don't have to be unique. You can use whatever class you want, wherever you want. So I'm going to put the, I'm going to add the class attribute to both of my middle tags here, my middle p tags. So I have 2 p tags that have the class of middle. Okay. And nothing has changed because I haven't actually styled that middle class. Okay. So back up in my style tag, I have the h1 element selector, the p element selector, the bottom ID selector, and now I'm going to add the middle class selector. And that's very similar, except instead of a hash, you have a dot, and then the name of the class. So middle. And again, I don't know, I didn't plan any of this ahead. What do I want to change? I want my middle elements to have, I don't know, let's say a background color is easy to see, so maybe I'll just stick with that. Background color of maybe red, nice eye-searing red. So I'm going to save that, I'm going to refresh, and indeed, now both of my elements that have the middle class attribute have the background color of red, or more generally, they have any styling that I put into these curly braces. So those are the 3 kinds of selectors you can use in CSS. You can use element selectors, which select every tag of a certain type, so H1 or P or UL or LI or whatever. Then you can have ID selectors, which select a single element with one ID. And then you can have class selectors, which you can apply anywhere you want. Multiple elements can have the same class. So that is class selectors. Okay. One other thing I want to mention with class selectors is, so here's another difference between IDs and classes. So with this bottom element, this bottom p tag, I gave it the ID of bottom, but what if I wanted to have like 2 different sets of styles? So as an example, maybe I'll split some of this up a little bit in a second, but how would I apply two different rules or sets of rules to the same element? And you can't do that with IDs. You can only have one ID per element, but the same thing is not true of classes. And how do I want to do this? So maybe what I'll do, maybe I'll take just a really quick break to restructure my CSS rules. I've kind of done like arbitrary things here. So maybe I'll clean it up. Maybe instead of having middle, what I'll have is like dot red. And I'll change that to red, and I'll change that to red. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Cool, okay. And maybe I'll have a different class, which is something like dot border. Okay, and the border will be border of, I don't know, thick, maybe. Is that what we had before? Solid. Solid was the word. Okay, so now I have two different classes. I haven't actually used my dot border class yet. Let me maybe get rid of some of this. I know this is not super interesting, but let me get rid of this border here. Okay, so now all of my p tags have no border, and they have different colors based on whether they have the dot red class or not. And now what if I want some of these other p tags to have a border and some of them not? This is kind of arbitrary. This could be any set of CSS rules, but the idea is the same. So I want, let's see, I want maybe my top, this first red one to have a border, and maybe this bottom one. So my name is Kevin and I love CSS. I want to add a border here. And the way I can do that is to add the, what did I call it, border class here with a space and then border. So what's happening here is I'm giving this particular element two different classes. I'm saying this is red and it's border. So both of those classes. These are arbitrary. I chose them based on the content, but this could be, any name. This could be any name. Let's refresh. And there we go. We have this particular p tag, this my name is Kevin and I love CSS, is both red and has a border. And similar kind of idea down here. Maybe I want to have the bottom p tag here have a class and an ID, and that's totally fine. You can do that. Class equals border here as well. Maybe I'll add some white space just to clean it up. Okay, so this p tag has an ID of bottom and a single class of border. This could be multiple classes just like we did up here, but the idea is that you can kind of mix and match both IDs and classes on the same element. Okay, so now my bottom element is styled based on both its ID and its class. So its ID of bottom says here, make the font size bigger and make the background color blue. The class border says, give me a solid border. And so you can mix and match different like levels of styling based on what you need to do. Okay. Let's see. One other thing I'll do just to demonstrate that kind of cascading nature of CSS is we have the ID of bottom, which adds a background color of red. Okay, and we have this class, this ID of bottom, which has a background color of cyan, right. So the ID of bottom has a cyan background color, okay, which makes sense because that's here. Now the red class has a background color of red. So similar to the question that I had earlier about like what will win, so what if I say red here? So similar to how we said this P class is both red and border. Okay, now I'm saying this P class has an ID of bottom, and we can look at what that style is, background color of cyan, okay, and a class of border, which gives it the border, and of red, which gives it the red background. So we have two different background colors specified. Which will win? And I'm going to refresh to find out. And looks like the ID background won. And again, that's because of the idea of specificity, where IDs will generally win. Classes are not quite as specific as IDs, so any styling that you put in an ID selector will kind of win over the styles that you put in a class selector or in an element selector. Classes are more specific than elements, so it's kind of a hierarchy. Okay, so you can apply different IDs and different classes to your various elements, and then style those IDs and classes in your style tag in your CSS. Cool. Okay, next I want to talk about external style sheets, so right now, so far, what we've done is use this style tag, and we've used them like inside of our HTML file, and that'll work. That's fine. It's especially fine for like smaller example projects, where if you're just testing something out, it'll work fine. But eventually, it'll get kind of hard to maintain because like it's already kind of hard. I have to kind of keep scrolling to switch back and forth between, am I looking at the CSS or the HTML, and like going back and forth is annoying. It also limits me to only styling one page at a time. So you can imagine a world where my web page isn't just one single HTML file. Maybe I have a home page and an about page, maybe a contact page, maybe I don't know, like a thumbnail grid of images or something. But more than one file, more than one HTML file. You can imagine that if I want to style all of those pages in a similar way, like I want every p tag on every page to have the same font. If I did it this way, I would have to put that in every single HTML file, and it'll be a lot of copy pasting. And if you wanted to make a change, you would have to make the change on every single page in every single file, and it would just get really annoying. But luckily, you don't have to do that. So you can use what is called external style sheets, which is like really the standard. These internal style sheets are kind of the exception to the rule. So what I am going to do is create a new file called styles.css. You can name your file whatever you want, similar to how you can name your HTML file anything you want. Luckily, I already have one over here because it's just in the repo by default. And I'm going to take all of the CSS that I just wrote. I'm going to cut it and I'm going to paste it into here. So now I have the styles.css file that contains my CSS selectors and properties. Okay. And then I'm going to use this kind of magic line, and generally I don't remember it, so I always copy paste it. And I'm going to sort of replace my style tag with that. And so what this is doing is it's using the link HTML tag, and it has some special, attributes that I honestly never really think too hard about. But here's the part that you need to care about. Here's the name of the CSS file. So if you called yours, like my styles or like my beautiful website styles.css, you would change that here as well. So I'm going to save that. And what I hope will happen is that when I go back here and refresh, nothing will have changed. Yeah, okay, cool. And that's because all I've done is move my CSS out of the style tag in the HTML file itself into its own file here, styles.css over here. So this line tells the HTML to take whatever CSS is in this file and apply that to the rest of the page. So you'll see this syntax most often because this is the more common way that CSS is sort of organized and written in its own file. Okay, what's next? So I already sort of talked about cascading, the idea that different selectors have different levels of specificity, and the more specific the selector is, the higher of a priority it is given. So if you have a background color on a element selector and a background color on a class selector, the class selector will win. So you can kind of set up like more and more specific rules. You can say every p tag should have 20 pixel font size, except unless I use the class big, then I make it 30 pixels. But then I'm going to have an ID of like really big, and that's going to be 40 pixels or whatever. You can make it like more and more specific. So you start with your element selectors, then your class selectors, then your ID selectors. There are other ways that CSS gets more and more specific. So for example, this external style sheet is less specific than an internal style sheet. So if I have both an external and an internal style sheet, they'll fight and the internal style sheet will win. Generally you wouldn't do that, but it's kind of, I don't know, some trivia there for you. But the general idea is that specificity in CSS means that the more specific a selector is, the higher of a priority it gets. Okay, I think we're just about done. Was there anything else I wanted to talk about? Oh, okay. So inline styles. This is another thing you'll see fairly often, especially in like test code. So we've seen internal style sheets, which is just the style tag. We've seen external style sheets, which is this kind of goofy looking line that has link, blah, 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 blah. The other kind of style sheet that you'll see is inline styles, and that is the style attribute. So similar to other HTML attributes, it's just the style keyword, an equal sign, and then some value in quotation marks. And then this is basically, it's what you would put inside the curly braces. It's semicolon separated style rules. So let's see. So my H1 style, what did I already use? I used like bigger and dotted. So let's, I don't know, let's maybe add another background color. I can say the H1, this particular H1 has a background color of, I'm running out of colors, let's say yellow. And I'll add a semicolon. If I wanted to do more than one, I would just have a space, not a new line, and I would say blah, 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 blah. But just to get this, working, I'll say that, okay. Maybe the last thing I'll mention, just to kind of drive home the point of the cascading nature of CSS. I mentioned before that element selectors are less specific than class selectors, which are less specific than ID selectors. Same kind of idea applies here. So let's do this. So in my styles.css, I have H1, which has a border in here. So let me add a border in my inline style. So border colon and then some number or some value. So instead of, what did I have over here? Dash red. Instead, let me say like, I don't know, solid green. And then a semicolon. And I'm going to save that and I'm going to refresh over here. And there we go. So this inline style of setting the border is more specific than the style that's in this H1 tag. So you don't have to necessarily have, every rule around cascading memorized, as long as you know at a high level that in CSS, the cascading part of CSS is that the more specific you get, the higher priority a rule will have. And the other attribute of cascading is that they kind of add up. So I don't know, back to, let's see, like some of the examples we saw where every p tag has a background color of lime. And when I add a border class to it, then I have both lime and border. So let me see, where is that? So I have this p tag. Maybe I'll add class equals border here. So I save that and I'm going to refresh. And this p tag now has both the styles from the general tag selector here, element selector here, which gives it a lime background, and the style that I got when I added the class of border, because I have said that everything with a border class has a border. So you get both. So the cascading in cascading style sheets means that CSS rules kind of add together to create this mix, and as you get more specific, the rules have a higher priority. So that's what cascading means in cascading style sheets. Okay, that's about as far as I think I'm going to go in CSS. So very generally, I'll say that what I think you should try to remember is that the way CSS works is, first of all, you either have a style tag, or more often you'll see this kind of external style sheet syntax that points to a file, and in that file you'll have just a list of selectors, which can be element selectors like that, or ID selectors with the hash, or class selectors with the dot. And then after those selectors, you'll have curly braces, and then inside of those curly braces, you'll have a list of style rules. So style properties and style like values for those properties. And then in your HTML itself, you'll write HTML with either elements, well, definitely with elements, and those elements can have classes and IDs to kind of get more specific in your styling. So you can start with styling the element itself, and then add more specific styling for particular kinds of elements. So you can say, like, every element with the border class should have a solid border. Okay, that's CSS in a nutshell. I know that was probably confusing, so as you have questions, please let me know. But that's about as far as I'm going to go on CSS. So thanks for watching.